Why do the most empathetic people tend to be the ones who suffer most in silence? Why do they end up trapped in relationships where everything is confusing, where the blame always seems to be theirs? Why is it that the more they try to understand, the more pain they receive in return? There is an even more uncomfortable question. What if the person in front of you doesn't feel what you feel or think the way you think? Stay, because understanding this can completely change your way of seeing others and protecting yourself. People with a high capacity for empathy usually grow up believing that understanding others is an absolute virtue. They listen more than they speak, hesitate before causing harm, and always look for a logical explanation for other people's behavior. Precisely for that reason, they end up occupying a dangerous place in certain relationships. Not because they are weak, but because they are emotionally available, open, and willing to take responsibility even for things that don't belong to them. This type of person shares very clear traits. They tend to justify harmful attitudes by thinking there is pain, trauma, or misunderstanding behind them. When something doesn't add up, they look inward first and ask themselves what they did wrong. This predisposition towards self-criticism makes them the perfect ground for psychological manipulation. Gradually, they begin to doubt their memory, their perception, and even their own emotional judgment. In these dynamics, a constant pattern appears. The empathetic person clearly remembers what happened, but they are told they're exaggerating, misinterpreting, or being too sensitive. Over time, this repetition erodes their self-confidence. What was once an emotional certainty turns into confusion. They no longer ask what is happening, but rather if they have the right to feel the way they do. Another common element is chronic guilt. They are led to believe the conflict exists because they feel too much, because they react disproportionately, or because they don't know how to control their emotions. Thus, the focus shifts. The harmful behavior is no longer analyzed, and the problem becomes the reaction of the person suffering. This shift is subtle but devastating because it forces the victim to constantly adapt, to shrink, and to silence themselves. The most dangerous thing is that from the outside, these people don't look like victims. They are functional, intelligent, capable, and emotionally deep. Precisely for that reason, when they try to explain what they are going through, they are rarely taken seriously, and that is where the true isolation begins, when the pain no longer comes only from the relationship, but also from not being believed. To understand why these dynamics repeat themselves, it is necessary to abandon the simplistic idea that we are dealing with people who are simply toxic or emotionally immature. The behavior you have seen is not chaotic or impulsive. It responds to a well-defined psychological pattern known in psychology as the Dark Tetrad. This is not an insult or a popular label, but a clinical framework describing four personality traits that, when combined, create highly damaging individuals in interpersonal relationships. The first mistake of those with high empathy is to assume that everyone experiences emotions in the same way. They believe that even if someone acts with coldness or cruelty, deep down they feel guilt, remorse, or internal conflict. This assumption is dangerous because, in the Dark Tetrad, that emotional foundation simply does not exist in the same way. The absence or distortion of empathy is not a phase or a temporary wound, but a stable personality structure. The Dark Tetrad is composed of four distinct but complementary traits. Narcissism, which manifests as a constant need for admiration and validation. Machiavellianism, which turns relationships into strategic games where people are means to an end. Psychopathy, characterized by a lack of fear, guilt, and remorse. And finally, everyday sadism, which introduces real pleasure in the suffering of others. These traits do not always appear obviously. In fact, they often hide behind charisma, intelligence, security, and an apparent emotional depth. That is why they are so confusing for empathetic people. Because the language they use seems emotional, but the intention driving it is instrumental. They are not looking for connection, they are looking for control. Understanding this psychological map is not for demonizing, but for stopping the interpretation of harm as a misunderstanding. When you know you are facing someone who operates under these logics, you stop asking what you did wrong and start to understand why nothing you do seems like enough. Narcissism does not always present as obvious arrogance. In many cases, it appears as charm, confidence, and a surprising ability to attract attention. These people know how to read what others need to see and adapt to it. At the beginning of a relationship, they make the other person feel special, understood, even unique, not because they truly see them, but because they need that constant reflection to sustain their own image. The problem arises when that admiration stops flowing. The moment the empathetic person sets boundaries, expresses discomfort, or withdraws attention, the narcissist experiences it as a direct threat, not as a disagreement, but as an attack. The reaction is usually not dialogue, but emotional punishment. Coldness, contempt, silence, or outbursts of rage appear as mechanisms to restore lost control. Machiavellianism reinforces this pattern from another angle. Here there is no impulsiveness, but calculation. Every gesture, every word, and every conflict serves a strategic function. The relationship is not experienced as a bond, but as a game board. The emotions of the other are observed, measured, and used. The other's empathy becomes an advantage that can be exploited time and again. From this logic, people cease to be individuals with their own value and become resources. Someone is kept close as long as they are useful and discarded or punished when they stop fulfilling their function. There is no internal contradiction in this behavior because there is no real emotional commitment. There are only objectives, results, and benefits. For the empathetic person, this scenario is deeply confusing. They try to reason, explain, and connect. They believe that if they find the right words, the other person will understand the harm caused. But that dialogue never arrives because they are not playing the same game. While one seeks understanding, the other only evaluates advantages. This mismatch is what is emotionally exhausting. It is not the intensity of the conflict, but the constant feeling of speaking a language that the other does not need to understand. Unlike narcissism and Machiavellianism, where there is still a need for image or strategy, psychopathy introduces an even more unsettling element, the real absence of an emotional break. These people do not experience fear, guilt, or remorse in the same way most do. Their emotional system reacts very little to consequences, allowing them to lie, betray, or harm without the internal weight that would stop others. From a neurological standpoint, this is not a metaphor. Studies show that certain areas of the brain, especially those related to processing fear and emotional empathy, respond in an attenuated way. Therefore, when an empathetic person tries to appeal to conscience, the pain caused, or moral logic, they get no response. It's not that they don't want to understand, it's that those emotional registers simply don't activate. Everyday sadism adds an even more disturbing layer. Here it is no longer just about indifference to the suffering of others, but a positive response to it. Seeing the other confused, hurt, or off balance generates a sense of power and, in some cases, pleasure. Not necessarily physical, but psychological. A silent satisfaction in seeing that they still have control. This trait does not always manifest openly. Often it appears in small, repeated actions. Comments that humiliate, constant contradictions, promises broken just when they generate hope. Each gesture seems minor, but the cumulative effect is devastating. The victim wears themselves out trying to understand why someone would cause harm so persistently. Something key happens here. The empathetic person projects their own internal limit onto the other. They believe that at some point the pain will be too much, that something will stop that behavior. But that limit does not exist. And the more evident the wound becomes, the clearer it is who has control of the situation. One of the most frequent questions is whether these people are made this way or born this way. The answer is not simple, but it is crucial for breaking the illusion of change. Some traits, like psychopathy, show a strong biological basis. They do not appear because of a bad relationship or a difficult phase. They are part of a deep personality structure. Other traits, like Machiavellianism, can be developed and reinforced by the environment, power, or impunity. The most common mistake of empathetic people is believing that if they understand the origin of the harm, they can fix it. They think that love, patience, or understanding can repair what seems broken. But this logic starts from a false assumption that the other experiences the bond from the same emotional depth. And that is not the case. This is where the concept of selective empathy comes in. Many of these individuals are perfectly capable of identifying emotions, reading reactions, and anticipating responses. But they do not feel what the other feels. They distinguish between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. They understand the pain, but they do not experience it as their own. That difference changes everything. That is why they can apologize without real guilt, promise changes without intention of fulfilling them, and show affection without internal commitment. It is not conscious hypocrisy in all cases, but a deep emotional disconnection. The love they project does not work like yours. It is a tool, not a bond. While the empathetic person invests energy trying to heal the relationship, the other party evaluates if that effort is still useful. Change only occurs when there is a clear gain. And when there is no longer a gain, the dynamic returns exactly to the same point. None of this happens by chance. People with dark tetrad traits don't choose just anyone. They observe, test, and analyze before truly getting involved. They look for specific profiles: empathetic, responsible, reflective individuals with a strong tendency to justify and take on the blame. Not because they are weaker, but because they are more emotionally predictable. The process begins subtly: small tests of boundaries, ambiguous comments, unexpected mood swings. Every reaction is recorded. If the other person doubts, explains, apologizes, or tries to fix the situation, the signal is clear. There is access. From there, the dynamic intensifies. One of the most powerful mechanisms activated is the traumatic bond. The relationship alternates between moments of intense closeness and phases of coldness or punishment. This unpredictability isn't accidental. The human brain releases more dopamine when the reward is intermittent. Thus, affection becomes addictive. One doesn't seek well-being, one seeks relief. Added to this is the constant distortion of reality. Harm is minimized, facts are rewritten, and the other person's memory is questioned. The empathetic person begins to doubt themselves, trusting the other's version more than their own experience. The more they try to clarify the situation, the more trapped they become. Getting out of this cycle is not a matter of willpower. It is a complex neurological and emotional process. The mind continues to wait for the return of what initially seemed real. And as long as that hope exists, the door remains ajar. Although from the outside these people may seem strong, confident, or even admirable, the internal cost of these traits is much higher than what they show. The absence of deep empathy is not a real advantage, but a limitation. Their emotional world is flat, repetitive, and lacking in genuine connection. They need constant stimulation, control, and validation because, without them, a void appears that they don't know how to name. This is why power, manipulation, or dominance are never enough. Each victory quickly loses its effect. Pleasure wears off, excitement wanes, and the search must begin again. It is a race without a finish line, a cycle that never completes. From the outside, it may look like freedom. From the inside, it is a silent form of dependency. Here arises the hardest truth for the empathetic person to accept. It is not that you didn't love enough or that you failed to communicate. You weren't trying to repair something broken. You were trying to connect with someone who does not function from the same emotional place. There are no words, sacrifices, or understanding that can create what does not exist. The way out is not to confront or prove anything. It is clinical distance, conscious withdrawal, and the deep understanding that the problem was never your sensitivity. That sensitivity is precisely what makes you human. What you must let go of is not your empathy, but the idea that everyone shares it. When you understand this, something changes. You stop looking for explanations within yourself and start protecting who you are. And that is true recovery.